Well, hello everyone, it's Kim from the Shamrock Quilt Studio, and I'm back today with a video about our Deck the Halls quilt. This is our Christmas quilt, and we've got the top completely finished. We've covered this in a couple of episodes, and today's episode is all going to be about sandwiching the quilt. But before we get to that, I wanted to share with you that in addition to what you've seen on the previous videos, I did decide to go back in and add a small border in the green fabric around the rest of the quilt. And I cut a 2.5-inch strip, and I'm using 1/4-inch seams for this. So this will be a 2-inch finished strip when we're done. And you can see that that closely mimics the size of the candy stripe quilt. So let me rearrange my furniture here and raise this up a little bit so we can actually work on sandwiching this quilt with the batting and the backing, and I'll be back in just a moment with that information. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Okay, well that was a challenge. We don't often record in the studio in a standing position, so we had to move a lot of stuff around. One great thing is I have a table that cranks up to what I would call even higher than counter height. So it really is good when we have situations like this where I need to either sandwich a quilt or I'm working on maybe some cutting that's going to take a long time and I prefer to stand. It is something that I wouldn't want to do all the time because it involves taking my machine off the table, but it is great for situations like this. So here is our Deck the Halls quilt, and I'm really happy for how it looks. Don't you agree? It's very cheerful, it is evocative of the season, and I think it's just going to be great. So let's start working on getting it together. We've got the top all done, and I've done all the sewing with a white thread. So I don't really have to worry about threads catching underneath. Because maybe I pieced with a darker thread and it's going to show. The only thing that might show would be the red threads from the fabric, or maybe the green ones. I'm looking at this and I can see that the red is raveling just a little bit, and that's because it's just been handled, and that does happen. But you know what? We're not going to worry about that too much because this is for fun. And I don't want to get too deep into that perfectionist thinking. I find that that will slow me down almost to a standstill if I let that take over. So I'm going to go grab my batting and my backing, and I'll be right back and we'll start with this. So let's get started. Here's our top, and we're going to put it to the side for just a moment. And I am going to try to keep this on the table because as I pin the pieces together, this will help me not nick my table so much. I'd really love it if it were full length, but I've not found one quite that big yet. Well, that batting is doing what it does best, and that's sticking to fabric. But we'll get it undone here. Okay, for our backing, check out the video that I did on matching seams for backing. The fabric that I used in that video is the backing for this project, and that could be helpful for you. And I'm going to include it in the playlist for this as well, so it'd be easy to find. Okay, so for the backing, I chose to get 4 yards of this polka dotted fabric, and I matched it up with a seam just in the middle, which gave us a a huge piece of fabric, and we're not going to need that much. Now, what we will need is for this seam to go across the skinnier portion of the project. And I think what I'm going to do to make that happen is I'm going to run the seam right here in the middle. And I'm placing this backing right side down. And I really need a weight. We'll use that for a moment. Okay, that'll work a little bit better. All right, we'll put this down too. I've taken everything out down here that I can just to give us enough room to work efficiently. And then I'm going to have the edge of this fabric come just over the back side here, maybe by 1.5 to 2 inches. And I want to try to keep it as straight as I can. Okay. Next point. Batting. This project was, geez, what was it? 50 by 66, I think. And we added a 2-inch border all the way around. So now we're at 54 by 60. Well, batting doesn't come in 60-inch lengths. It comes either in pre-cut sizes or it comes in a 90-inch wide roll. And I went ahead and got a piece off the roll that is going to work for this, and I think I got 2 yards. I was going to opt for a smaller piece and got to thinking about if it wasn't rolled on there properly or it wasn't cut properly, it might not fit. So that's what I did. Now the question is, which is the 90? I think that's the shorter side. So we're going to run the 90 on my side over here. Oh yeah, lots longer. And I'm using this as my area that I'm going to bookmark to kind of line everything up. I was going to have the seam go right down the middle, but I think we will use our fabric more efficiently if we just let that seam fall where it may. I don't think it's really going to matter too much. Okay. And I'm going to line up this selvage edge of the fabric here along the selvage edge of the batting. Okay, and I guess our fabric is sticking out about 1 inch. So we've got this in place, and just to hold it there, I'm going to get a really large safety pin, almost 1 inch. And I'm just going to pin that in place, kind of to hold our place. All right, now we need to see if we can't get this batting and backing fabric kind of married together. And you'll feel underneath places where one or the other is not flat, and you'll just have to work those out. This can sometimes be the most time-consuming part of sandwiching a quilt. But we've got plenty of yardage here in our backing and our batting. So it's just going to be a matter of putting it together. Okay, now let me show you what's going on so you'll know. We're going to swap it all over. And I think I'm going to take this off after all. It's like fighting an octopus underneath there. And we'll just have to be real careful about how we handle those pins. Okay, from this side I can see a little bit better what that backing fabric is doing, and I can get a better match for the two pieces because I'm going here from the pin and I'm pressing my way out. And it's almost like it's gluing them together just because that batting grips so well. That's why people use it for their design boards. Because once it hooks to that, it's going to want to stay. So we're just going to continue that along the top here. I think this is going to be one of your areas that you're going to struggle with the most if you're working in a small area. I know I like to think that I have a small sewing room. I think we're about 10 by 10. And there's not a whole lot of room in here, but I know that there have been other times in my sewing where I've had no room. It was the top of the dining room table, the kitchen table, a little bookcase desk area. You just had to sew where you had any amount of room at all. And then things like this were done on the floor or something like that. Okay, I think we've gotten this very end done, but I think we're kind of twisty in here. So what we're going to do, I have seen hacks where people use pool noodles to do this, and I certainly understand how that could be helpful. Because if you could wrap that fabric around that pool noodle and it didn't come in contact with the batting until you were ready to match it up, that would really be good. Now, I'm going to quit talking a moment and get this matched up so I could speed up this film a little bit and you can see what's going on. But the basic concept is we want to match the backing fabric to the batting, get all of the wrinkles out both in the backing and the batting, and from there then we will put the quilt top on. So I'll be back with you as soon as I get it all matched up. Well, I'm going to take a break from trying to sandwich this for just a second to maybe give you some pointers or some encouragement at this point, because I think that this can be one of the most frustrating parts of putting your quilt together. It's like trying to wrestle a octopus while a alligator is trying to bite you sometimes, because the fabric wants to grab to the batting. The batting doesn't really want to cooperate. It just wants to grab a hold. And right now I've got this, I would say, 85 to 90% matched. But I do have some areas where I don't think it's a really good match. I think we started out pretty good, and as we came along, then we kind of lost track of it. And some of it could be because there are wrinkles or folds in the batting. And I found that the only way around that is to flip it over to the other side so that your batting is on top, and then spread the batting side as well. So it's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of manual work. It will certainly give you a little bit of stretching exercise. But we are probably about 85–90% there in matching it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe cut the camera. I'm going to flip this over to the other side and spread it a while. I will say that what I'm working with now is much bigger than our quilt top. So if I can get that one edge matched up and married together so that they are a good fit, then I can pin my top on and cut the excess off, and then I'll have much less to manage. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that over now, and I'll cut the camera. I won't show you this whole thing because it is going to take a while. You can see how many wrinkles there are on this batting right here, and that has to do with the way it is rolled on the core when you buy it in the store. And if you've ever even tried to roll fabric over a ruler or something, you know that it starts out great, and then it kind of adjusts itself. And by the time you get to the end, it's not exactly the way you started. So that's what's going on here. And you have a couple of other options. You could always use an adhesive spray to spray this if you're just really struggling with it. I don't typically do that because I don't have a place to spray other than in my sewing room, and I don't want to do that. I don't want the extra chemicals. I don't want that adhesive floating around in the air or on the things hanging on the walls, so I try not to do that. If I had a place I could do it outside and the fabric would stay clean, especially the batting, because if you take raw uncovered batting outside, any tiny little piece of yard trash, pieces of grass, little slivers of a leaf, they're going to get on this batting and they're going to drive you crazy. So I try not to do that unless I really have to. But if you had maybe a flat piece of ground with a couple of big folding tables, that might work for you. Anyway, I'm going to work on this a little bit longer, and when I come back, we'll move on to getting that top on here. Okay, we're back. Now, I flipped it over and I put the batting on the top. And I spread it out probably the first half. And then I pulled it back. And so I've got this section here in this corner of it pretty well flattened out. It's not perfect. It's not the way we're going to leave it. But it is close. And then I picked this corner here to be the place where we're going to start positioning our quilt. And I can tell that I want to check one thing real quick because we may have to adjust this just slightly. Yeah, we are going to have to adjust it just a little bit. What we're going to have to do is come down just a little bit because that batting is not cut just quite straight, so we want to make sure we've got plenty of coverage on that batting. Now, then on this side, what I did was I looked underneath to make sure that the edge of this green border was laying just on top of a red row of dots. And that kind of gives me a good feel for this being straight. What I did was I was still doing exactly what I was showing you. I was taking this and smoothing on those 3 layers together so we didn't have any folds or creases or anything in any of the 3 layers of fabric and material. And that can be quite trying. That batting wants to stick to the fabric and it doesn't want to let go of its folds. So it's kind of a wrestling match almost. But I finally got this on properly. And part of my process in doing this is I'll smooth one side and then I'll flip it over and smooth it again. And if I need to peel back a layer and smooth the inner layers and then come back with that layer again, I will. And I think I've pretty much got all of them out. I see one right here that I don't. And I'm wondering now what that is. But it's just a process of doing it, turning it over, doing it again, because you will get to a point where you get all of those creases and folds out. And let's see if I can find that one. It might be good just to see. Now, I do notice that when I'm running my hands over this, there are areas where it's thicker and you might think there's a fold in the batting, but what it is it's those seams underneath what we've pieced. And what I'm looking for is a diagonal fold. And I don't feel it now. It may have been just how it was sitting. And it's very interesting how that happens. But what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to quilt by machine on this project. We're in a bit of a time crunch because we want it finished before the holidays so we can enjoy it. Or if you're choosing to give this as a gift, you want it finished and done before that gift giving time comes along. So we've got it all smoothed, and like I said, it's just a process of going back and forth to the front, to the back. And when you finally get it the way you want it, then I would encourage that you put some quilting safety pins in. And that's going to be, it's a couple of different kinds. But usually the quilting pins have a little curve in them. Some of them have the little circle at the back end of them and some do not. So here's one with it, here's one without. And all it is just a safety pin that has a bit of curve in it, so it makes it a little bit easier to get it through all of those layers of fabric. And when you're pinning, make sure that you reach under there and get all 3 layers, and you want to smooth right before you put that. Don't bend it way far up and do it before you smooth, and hold it together because that will shift the fabrics. So I'm going to put some pins in here, and then I'm going to set my machine up, which means breaking all this down again and getting us at a table height so we can sew. And what I'm going to do is I am going to sew just like a either in the ditch seam or a little echo seam right at the edge of this candy stripe. I think I may do it just on the white part of this candy stripe, just slightly in there. So I'll need to use some type of visual guide to help me keep that as straight as I can. And we're going to be sewing that by machine, and it is difficult to sew a project this large on your domestic machine simply because the throat size of the machine is not very large and you're trying to shove a huge quilt into a little tiny hole. But it can be done, and you just have to take it slowly and work steady on that. I will be using a walking foot when I do this, which means I can't use a stitch in the ditch foot. So I'm just going to have to find some marking on that walking foot that I can use where I'm placing the seam and where I'm sewing the seam so that they're even. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew, the first thing we're going to sew is this sashing right down the middle, the short side, not the long side, but the short side. And the reason for that is we're going to start in the middle and sew out so that if we have any problems and we need to smooth, we can stop and smooth along the way. And what is happening is we're going to roll up the side that goes in the machine throat as small as we can, and that will be the place we're sewing that will have the most fabric shoved up in there. So if we can do that first stitch seam, we should be able to do it all. Because even though these are longer, getting to these sashings is less fabric than this way. I hope that made sense to you. I think if you sit down and kind of think about it, you will. And if your project is bigger, I really don't know what to tell you. This is probably going to be the largest quilt that I've quilted on my machine at home. Usually if they get any bigger than this or this big, I usually do it by hand, but I want to get it finished. And I don't want to be dealing with this 3 weeks before Christmas. So I'm going to pin this, I'm going to set up my room, and I'm going to start to prepare to machine quilt it, and I will bring you back at that time to show you how I'm working through that, what settings I'm using on my machine. I think I'm just going to use a plain stitch. I had thought about doing something kind of fancy, but I think I'm just going with a plain stitch. That'll be easier. All right, we're back at the sewing machine. We got the table cranked down to, I think it's the right height, but we're going to get started and see how much we can do in a little bit of time just to show you what's going on. Okay, so I set my machine up, I put my walking foot on, and I have the cover off of my walking foot. Here's the cover, because it rubs when it sews, and I find that, I don't know if I find it to be disturbing to me personally or just disturbing in general in the way that that works. Okay, so I've got a spool of white thread in here. I've got a pretty good bit on this spool. I think I should have enough. And what I've done is I've taken a sample of 2 fabrics with some batting in it and just run some test stitches. And what I've decided to do is use a basic straight stitch. And I set this on number 1 as far as tension, because when I ran these stitches, that's the one that I liked the best, the way it looked. It gave me just a little bit of definition between the 2 stitches, the top and the bobbin. And I am going to just to be absolutely certain, I'm going to reload my bobbin, and I'm also going to reload my thread. because sometimes that will give us a little difference in the appearance of our stitch. It will also help it sew a little more smoothly. And with these automatic threaders, that is not a problem. I used to absolutely hate it when I had to rethread my machine with my older machine because it was just such a pain. Okay, so we've got that in there, and I'm going to run just a quick little test again to see if I like the way that looks. I wish it had a little more definition between the stitches, but I think that's just the way it's set up. Let's try a 2. Okay, I like the 2 a little better. We're going to try 3. Three's even better. Ooh, I do like that. I'm glad I did that. Okay, we're going to go one more. We're going to go to 5 and see. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it on the 5. I like the way that looks. Now I've got it set up with kind of a long stitch. For my machine, when it has just a regular straight stitch, the zigzag part of it is 4.5, which I've never understood how you get a zigzag setting when you've got a straight stitch. And then the length is 3.5, so it is much longer than we normally use, but that's what the kind of look that I want on this machine quilting. Okay, and if we do have to take any of it out, it's going to be much easier to take out that little bit longer stitch. Okay, it's catching on my board. What we were going to do, I just dumped all my pins on the floor. That's just fabulous. But they're in that magnetic bowl, so hopefully that won't be a problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fold/roll this up. So we need to capture in 2 of these rows because we're going to sew right there in the middle. I'm just going to do this. Yeah, we'll get it folded. Now, some of you may like to sew standing up. I don't really care for that. I think there are times when it's appropriate. I'm not sure that I'm going to want to try that for this. Okay, we're going to just roll that up. All right, and if we stretch it back, then we've got it. And if you had some nice big clamps, now would be the time to use that. But we're going to sew right here. So I want to take all of this fabric and put that roll in the middle of my machine. And then all of this is going to be loose. And this is where I say you're going to be wrestling with this machine. I'm going to position it so that my stitch is just on the white side of the seam so that the stitches are in the white and the candy stripe has no stitch. And I'm going to set my machine a little on the slow side so we can just kind of monitor this. And it's probably, I would say, 1/8 of an inch from the seam. I might make that a little bit closer, because I think the closer it is, the more likely you'll be able to keep it consistent. Okay. It is going to be difficult. It is going to be a challenge. We'll say that. I hate to predetermine that something's going to be difficult because I've had a difficult day already. So we're going to start and we're just going to stitch. Okay, I'm I'm going to stop and I'm going to reposition everything, and I'm going to get my fabric straight again, and I'm kind of feeling to make sure everything is smooth underneath. Okay, we have gone about 8 inches. 8 inches, and so far no trouble, right? So we're going to try it a little further, and we're just going to keep positioning this fabric as we go. And I'm just kind of guiding that through. The walking foot is going to pull the fabric, but there's so much weight from all of this fabric that I don't want my machine to have to work too hard. So it's just a gentle assist. Okay, we're coming up here to a corner block. And we'll have a little seam, so we want to make sure that we sew over that smoothly. So only where these cross are you going to have stitches in the candy stripe fabric. And there's definitely something wrong with the height. That's either too high or too low, because I can already feel it in my back. And you just want to keep checking to make sure that the stitches you've put in are like you want them to look. They're even. You can see them. They're this right distance from your seam. Just want to keep watching your distance from your seam. Notice mine was getting a little close back there. Okay, we're coming up to the edge, or to the end of this stripe. And if I feel underneath here, I can feel that there's a little bubble of fabric that has moved all through the length of this quilt down to the end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the pin here at the end, because if I leave it in, it's just going to give me an unsightly bubble, and we don't want that. And then I'm just going to smooth it out and continue to sew. And I'm only sewing to the edge of the candy stripe fabric, and I'm going to do a little back stitch there. We did not do one when we started. I would recommend that you do. Okay, and we're going to cut our thread, and we can pull it out. Now we've got one line of stitches all the way across here at this candy stripe. I'm going to go ahead and do the stitch on the other side of this candy stripe before I move everything around again. But after I finish that, then I'm going to lay it out and I'm going to smooth it again, because we adjusted it when we took that pin out. So what we might find is when we sew the next candy stripe down, we have to do the same thing. There are a lot of thoughts about sewing one direction and then sewing the other direction. I don't particularly like that when I'm dealing with straight fabrics, because what I find is you've got these two sewing lines working in opposite directions, and if you have any adjustments like we just did, it's going to pull them out of straight. So they're not going to be straight anymore. You're going to have one kind of going this one and one kind of going this way. And if you're not super careful, that will show up and you will see that. So I'm going to do the two sewing the same way, and then I'm going to smooth again, and at that point I'll decide if I'm going to keep them all going the same way. More than likely they're all going to come the same way, and then that way everything is consistent, and then I'll do the same thing with the longer seams. But you could just see that even on this machine, and this probably has an 8-inch throat, the little markings in here, that's what they seem to indicate. So we were able to do the seam that had the most fabric rolled up and put in here that we will have on this. So this is completely doable. I'm going to go ahead and sew all of these stitches around these sashings, and then I'm going to sew a final stitch all the way around in the little green border that we put in just on the outside of the candy stripe, and that will hold everything together in a square. Now we're not at 10 inches, but that will put everything together so that I can work on binding for our next show. And I want you to be able to see the binding before we finish that. And then I will come back and put in the stitching in the middle of the blocks after we finish our series. And you could choose to do that as well or do it as you go, your choice. I just want to keep our series moving so that we can get this in the 6 episodes that this is going to be. So that's where we are today and how we've moved forward. And I hope that you've enjoyed this and you've found something interesting and informative in what I've shown you today with sandwiching that quilt and now with machine stitching it. So we'll probably just do something simple in the middle of these boxes or these blocks to meet our 10-inch sewing requirements and just let it be. If you would please give us a thumbs up for this video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share us with a friend. And we'll be back next week with our final video in this episode, and we will cover the binding for this. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.